Captain Mikhail Myagkiy sat in the alert shack at Monchegorsk, deep inside the Arctic Circle, when the klaxon shattered the silence. His heart rate spiked instantly. He knew exactly what that sound meant. The Americans were coming. Somewhere over the Norwegian Sea, invisible to the naked eye but burning bright on Soviet radar screens, a black shape was screaming toward the Kola Peninsula at 3 times the speed of sound. In exactly 16 minutes, Myagkiy would be airborne in his MiG-31 Foxhound, climbing toward an aircraft he could track on radar but never catch. He had done this 14 times before. 14 times he had watched the American spy plane slip away untouched. Today would be no different. Years later, when the Cold War had ended and the secrets could finally be told, Myagkiy described what those alerts felt like. The appearance of an SR-71 was always accompanied by nervousness, he recalled. Everyone began to talk in frenzied voices, to scurry about, and react to the situation with excessive emotion. He admitted something else, something that captured the very essence of what Soviet pilots faced every time that black aircraft appeared on their screens. The speed and altitude of the American aircraft simply hypnotized everyone. This is the story of the fastest aircraft ever built, the Soviet pilots who tried desperately to destroy it, and why every single one of them failed. Over 3,500 missions through the most hostile airspace on Earth. More than 1,000 surface-to-air missiles fired at it. Not a single one ever connected. No interceptor aircraft in history ever achieved a successful engagement. The record is perfect, and it belongs to an aircraft that stopped flying over 25 years ago. The aircraft that haunted Soviet radar operators was born from disaster. On May 1, 1960, an SA-2 surface-to-air missile exploded near Francis Gary Powers and his U-2 spy plane over Sverdlovsk in the Soviet Union. The aircraft tumbled from 70,000 feet. Powers survived and was captured. President Eisenhower was humiliated on the world stage. The message was unmistakable. Altitude alone could no longer protect American reconnaissance aircraft from Soviet defenses. But the Central Intelligence Agency had already anticipated this moment. 2 years earlier, in 1958, they had approached Clarence Leonard Kelly Johnson at Lockheed's Advanced Development Projects Division, better known as the Skunk Works. Johnson was arguably the greatest aircraft designer in American history. Born February 27, 1910, in Ishpeming, Michigan, he joined Lockheed in 1933 and rose to lead the company's most secretive division. The Skunk Works name itself originated when engineer Irving Culver, working near a foul-smelling plastics factory, answered his phone with a joke reference to the comic strip Lil Abner, saying "Skunk Works, inside man Culver here." Johnson personally led the design of over 40 aircraft, including the P-38 Lightning that enabled the mission to kill Admiral Yamamoto, the F-104 starfighter, and the U-2 itself. Now the CIA asked him for something that had never existed. They wanted an aircraft that could outrun any missile ever built. Johnson's team cycled through 12 design iterations code-named Archangel. The 12th became the A-12 Oxcart, a single-seat Mach 3 reconnaissance platform so secret that the CIA financed it through a front company called C&J Engineering with mail drops in Sunland, California. The first A-12 was trucked to Groom Lake, Nevada, the facility later known as Area 51, under cover of darkness in February 1962. Test pilot Lou Schork made its maiden flight on April 30th that same year. By February 1964, the A-12 sustained Mach 3.2 at 83,000 feet for 10 consecutive minutes. The Air Force wanted their own version with a second seat for a dedicated reconnaissance systems officer to operate the sensors. That aircraft became the SR-71. On December 22, 1964, test pilot Robert J. Gilliland lifted the first SR-71 into the California sky from Air Force Plant 42 inches Palmdale. He took it to Mach 1.5 at 50,000 feet. The first flight was relatively uneventful, he recalled afterward. Just one emergency and another minor problem. Not bad. As initial test flights go, Gilliland would personally fly each of the 32 SR-71s as they came off the production line, logging more Mach 3 test hours than any pilot in history. The technical specifications were staggering by any measure. The aircraft's very name carries a famous story with two competing versions. The popular account claims the aircraft was originally designated RS-71 for reconnaissance strike, until President Lyndon Johnson misspoke at a July 25, 1964 press conference, saying SR-71 instead. According to this version, the Air Force changed 29,000 blueprints rather than embarrass the Commander-in-Chief. The better documented version, researched by former SR-71 pilot Colonel Rich Graham using audio tapes and the Lyndon B. Johnson Library archives, reveals that General Curtis LeMay had lobbied to change the designation to SR for strategic reconnaissance. Before the speech, Johnson said SR-71 correctly. The White House stenographer, confusing it with the earlier RS-70 Valkyrie bomber designation, typed RS-71 in the press transcript, and the myth was born. The aircraft stretched 107 feet 5 inches long, with a 55-foot 7-inch wingspan. Two Pratt & Whitney J-58 engines produced 32,500 pounds of thrust each with afterburner. Below Mach 3.2, the J-58 operated as a conventional turbojet. Above that speed, airflow was bled from the fourth compressor stage through 6 bypass tubes directly into the afterburner, transitioning the propulsion cycle into something closer to a ramjet. At Mach 3.2 cruise, the inlet system consisted of 4% of total thrust, while the engine core provided only 7%. The J-58 remains the only aircraft engine ever designed to operate continuously at maximum afterburning cruise. Fuel consumption at cruise reached approximately 36,000 to 44,000 pounds per hour, roughly 5,400 to 6,600 gallons. The aircraft burned JP-7, a specialized low-volatility fuel developed specifically for the Blackbird program. Conventional jet fuel would vaporize and auto-ignite at Mach 3 temperatures. JP-7 had a flash point of approximately 140 degrees Fahrenheit and served as the aircraft's primary heat sink, absorbing roughly 40,000 BTU per minute from avionics, hydraulics, and cockpit air conditioning, before being burned at temperatures exceeding 600 degrees Fahrenheit. Because JP-7 resisted ignition so stubbornly, each engine required triethylborane, a chemical that ignites spontaneously on contact with air, producing a distinctive green flash at startup. Each engine carried approximately 16 triethylborane shots, and managing this finite supply became critical on long missions. The airframe was 85 to 93% titanium alloy. At Mach 3.2, skin temperatures reached 800 degrees Fahrenheit at the nose and over 1,000 degrees on the engine cowlings. The windshield heated to 620 degrees, just 2.5 feet from the pilot's face. Because titanium panels were machined with expansion gaps to accommodate thermal growth of several inches during flight, the aircraft famously leaked fuel on the ground at ambient temperatures. The panels only sealed properly when heated during supersonic cruise. Ground crews joked that you could tell an SR-71 was ready to fly when the fuel puddle stopped growing. Perhaps the supreme Cold War irony was that the titanium came from the Soviet Union. Ben Rich, who succeeded Kelly Johnson as head of Skunk Works, later wrote about it. The CIA conducted a worldwide search and, using third parties and dummy companies, managed to unobtrusively purchase the base metal from one of the world's leading exporters, the Soviet Union. The Russians never had an inkling of how they were actually contributing to the creation of the airplane being rushed into construction to spy on their homeland. According to Colonel Rich Graham, one of the cover stories for the titanium purchases was that it was needed for manufacturing pizza ovens. The SR-71 entered operational service in January 1966 with the 9th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing at Beale Air Force Base, California. Forward deployments extended its reach across the globe. Detachment 1 at Kadena Air Base in Okinawa covered the Pacific Theater. The locals nicknamed the aircraft Habu after a venomous pit viper it resembled. SR-71 operations at Royal Air Force Mildenhall in England began in April 1976, covering the European and Arctic theatres. The first operational SR-71 sortie launched on March 21, 1968, when Major Jerome O'Malley and Major Edward Payne flew aircraft tail number 617976 from Kadena over North Vietnam. That aircraft would go on to fly 942 total sorties and 257 operational missions, more than any other SR-71 in the fleet. It now resides at the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. The aircraft's sensor suite was as revolutionary as its airframe. It included the Fairchild tracking camera, iTech KA-102, A cameras with up to 48-inch focal length capable of resolving objects just inches across from 80,000 feet, side-looking airborne radar, later upgraded to the Advanced Synthetic Aperture System with 1-foot resolution and electronic intelligence collection systems. The Astro-Inertial Navigation System tracked up to 61 stars through a quartz window, maintaining positional accuracy within approximately 1,000 feet at Mach 3 without any ground-based navigation aids. A single SR-71 could survey 100,000 square miles of terrain per hour from its cruising altitude. Vietnam operations began at 1 sortie per week and increased to nearly daily frequency by 1972. Hanoi in the late 1960s was described as the most heavily defended airspace on the planet. Approximately 800 surface-to-air missiles were fired at SR-71s during Vietnam operations. Pilots reported missiles passing as close as 150 yards from their aircraft. None scored a hit. Reconnaissance Systems Officer Major Jerry Crew described the first known missile fired at an SR-71 on July 26, 1968. Turning inbound on our first sensor run, I noticed the R light on my electronic countermeasures panel was illuminated. A North Vietnamese SAM site was tracking us. What we did not expect was the illumination of the M light, followed closely by the L light. This meant that the North Vietnamese had actually fired one or more missiles at us. They counted 60 seconds, the SA-2's self-destruct timer, and survived. Post-mission camera imagery confirmed 2 missiles had been launched. But it was the European theatre that produced the most dramatic recurring confrontations between the Blackbird and Soviet air defences. From Royal Air Force Mildenhall, the Baltic Express route became one of the Cold War's most extraordinary regular missions. The SR-71 would fly a counter-clockwise loop along the Norwegian coast, up past the Kola Peninsula, where the Soviets maintained their most sensitive naval and nuclear facilities, then south along the Swedish coast. Pilots carefully slowed to Mach 2.54 near the Åland Islands to avoid violating Swedish airspace. Between 1977 and 1988, 322 recorded Baltic Express sorties were flown. Every single one triggered a massive Soviet response. The Soviet Air Defense Forces, known by their Russian initials PVO, treated each SR-71 appearance as a maximum priority emergency. Swedish Air Force flight controllers monitored every Baltic Express mission from neutral airspace, and they documented both the American flights and the Soviet reaction with remarkable precision. Swedish radar stations achieved missile lock on the SR-71 during 51 of the 322 recorded sorties, tracking the aircraft as it maintained its careful course along international airspace boundaries. Retired Swedish Air Force controller Rolf Johnson described what he witnessed week after week. The most spectacular alerts in the Swedish Air Force during the 80s occurred about once a week when the Blackbird was operating in the Baltic. These were also probably the most frustrating events of the entire Cold War. Swedish records documented that MiG-25 PDs from Finno-Eberswalde in East Germany consistently reached approximately 63,000 feet as they trailed the SR-71 at a distance of 2.9 kilometers with, as Johnson noted, clockwork precision. They could track it. They could follow it. They could never catch it. Swedish radar stations observed the Soviet 15th Air Army scrambling Su-15 interceptors from Latvia, MiG-21 and MiG-23 fighters from Estonia, and MiG-25 Foxbats from East Germany, all simultaneously. A single unarmed reconnaissance aircraft generated a response from multiple fighter regiments across northern Europe. The intercept was considered a top priority not only for fighter aviation but also for the PVO's entire 10th Army, according to Myagkiy. The scheme for intercepting the SR-71 was computed down to the last second, Myagkiy explained after the Cold War ended. The MiGs had to launch exactly 16 minutes after the initial alert. There was no margin for error. If the fighters launched even slightly late, the Blackbird would already be gone. One of the most significant documented encounters occurred on June 3, 1986, when Majors Stormy Boudreau and Ted Ross departed Mildenhall in SR-71 tail number 6417980. Due to an abnormal contrail indicating the aircraft was flying lower than optimal altitude, 6 Soviet MiG-31 Foxhounds executed a coordinated turning intercept maneuver. The Soviet fighters were separated by approximately 15 miles, positioning themselves for what military analysts later described as an all-angle air-to-air missile attack that even a combination of high-altitude maneuverability and electronic countermeasures could not have defeated. This was the first time the Soviets demonstrated the multi-aircraft barrier tactic against the Blackbird, yet even with 6 of their most advanced interceptors in coordinated position, no engagement occurred. The SR-71 completed its mission and returned to Mildenhall untouched. On January 31, 1986, Myagkiy himself achieved an infrared lock on an SR-71 at 52,000 feet from a distance of 120 kilometers using his MiG-31's thermal sensor. His aircraft climbed to 65,676 feet, where the crew had the Blackbird in visual sight above them. They watched it cruise past, untouchable, at 80,000 feet. On what Soviet records later indicated was October 6, that same year, SR-71 pilot Ed Yelding spotted a MiG-31 contrail approaching head-on at approximately 100 miles over the Barents Sea. Yelding himself could not verify the exact date due to mission classification, but the encounter was documented in Soviet logbooks. The Soviet interceptor made a steep climbing turn, reaching approximately 65,000 feet according to Soviet accounts, about 10,000 feet below the SR-71. The MiG came within roughly 8 miles before running out of airspeed in the thin atmosphere. Yelding watched the MiG's nose drop below the horizon as the aircraft fell away, its engines unable to sustain flight at that altitude. Colonel Richard Graham recalled encounters in the Far East near Petropavlovsk on the Kamchatka Peninsula, where the Soviets maintained nuclear submarine pens. I could see, because it was a nice clear day, 3 MiG-25s in a clockwise orbit, he said. As I got closer, probably 100 miles out, I am up at 75,000 feet. They are down at about 30,000 feet. I saw them come off trail and they are contrailing in a straight line, in a trail formation about 10 miles apart. The MiG-25s lit afterburners attempting an intercept climb. They never came close. By the time they reached their maximum altitude, the Blackbird was already miles away, untouchable and untouched. Perhaps the most harrowing documented incident was declassified only in 2018. On June 29, 1987, SR-71 tail number 617964, flown by Majors Dwayne Knoll and Tom Veltri, suffered a catastrophic engine explosion at 75,000 feet and Mach 3 over the Baltic Sea. The crippled aircraft lost altitude rapidly and inadvertently violated Swedish airspace while the crew fought to maintain control. 4 Swedish JA-37 Viggen fighters scrambled to intercept. What the Swedish pilots found was an American aircraft in desperate trouble, trailing smoke and losing altitude. The National Security Agency later informed the American crew that at least 20 Soviet aircraft had been launched in response to the emergency. A MiG-25 received orders to force us to land or shoot us down, the crew was told during debriefing. The MiG-25 reportedly achieved missile lock on the damaged SR-71, but the Swedish escort deterred any Soviet engagement. The 4 Viggen pilots positioned themselves between the crippled Blackbird and the approaching Soviet interceptors, shielding the American aircraft until it could limp to safety. We did not know who would find us first, Reconnaissance Systems Officer Tom Veltri recalled years later. Seeing the Swedish plane escorting us was a pure liberation. This incident remained classified for over 30 years. On November 28, 2018, the 4 Swedish pilots who had protected the damaged American aircraft received United States Air Medals in a ceremony acknowledging their actions that day in 1987. The frustration of Soviet interceptor pilots emerged vividly from post-Cold War accounts. To this day, I have been averse even to ordinary school bells, Myagkiy admitted, because a bell was the first signal for a burst of adrenaline. Despite conducting 14 documented SR-71 intercepts between 1984 and 1987, he acknowledged the fundamental inadequacy of the Soviet response. The procedures for a successful intercept were crazy and completely inadequate when considered against the threat posed by the SR-71's spy flights. The most candid Soviet assessment came from Lieutenant Viktor Belenko, who defected to Japan in his MiG-25 on September 6, 1976. In his 1980 autobiography, Belenko described watching SR-71s from his base near Vladivostok. American reconnaissance planes, SR-71s, were prowling off the coast, staying outside Soviet airspace by photographing terrain hundreds of miles inland with side-angle cameras. They taunted and toyed with the MiG-25 sent up to intercept them, scooting up to altitudes the Soviet planes could not reach, and circling leisurely above them or dashing off at speeds the Russians could not match. On the planned intercept tactic, Belenko was blunt. They had a master plan to intercept an SR-71 by positioning a MiG-25 in front of it and one below it, and when the SR-71 passed they would fire missiles. But it never occurred. Soviet computers were very primitive, and there is no way that mission can be accomplished. On the fundamental technical reality, Belenko left no ambiguity. First of all, the SR-71 flies too high and too fast. The MiG-25 cannot reach it or catch it. The missiles are useless above 27,000 meters. Even if we could reach it, our missiles lack the velocity to overtake the SR-71 if fired in a tail chase. And if fired head-on, the guidance systems cannot adjust quickly enough to the high closing speed. As SR-71 pilot Colonel Darrell Cobb later relayed from conversations with Belenko, shooting down an SR-71 was the holy grail of Soviet air defense. Belenko's defection itself provided an intelligence windfall that confirmed what American crews had long suspected about the inadequacy of Soviet interceptors. When he landed his brand-new MiG-25P at Hakodate Airport in Japan on September 6, 1976, running critically low on fuel with approximately 2 minutes remaining, he handed the West a complete example of the Soviet Union's most advanced interceptor. The United States was permitted to examine his aircraft in detail, running its engines and measuring its radar and infrared signatures before returning it to the Soviets in 30 crates 67 days later. The revelations stunned Western analysts. The avionics used vacuum tubes, not solid-state electronics. The airframe was welded nickel steel, not the titanium Western intelligence had assumed. The Smerch-A radar was powerful at 600 kilowatts but crude, lacking look-down, shoot-down capability and vulnerable to electronic countermeasures. The aircraft's maximum G-load was a mere 2.2 G with full fuel, confirming it was no dogfighter. Belenko's debriefings, 5 months with the CIA plus years as a consultant, provided equally critical human intelligence. He confirmed the MiG-25 could not intercept the SR-71. He revealed that pilots typically limited themselves to Mach 2.5 to preserve engine life, with an absolute redline of Mach 2.83 for brief periods. He disclosed that Soviet base conditions were deplorable, with ground crews drinking windshield, de-icing alcohol, and replacing it with water. And he confirmed that the Super Foxbat, what became the MiG-31, was under development as a response to the Blackbird. The defection forced a complete Soviet response. Every MiG-25 in service required a new radar system since the Smerch-A's frequencies and capabilities were now compromised. The MiG-25 PD upgrade program launched immediately, and the MiG-31 program was accelerated. Belenko was granted American citizenship by Act of Congress, changed his name to Schmidt, and settled on a Wyoming ranch. He lived in constant fear of Soviet retaliation, rarely gave interviews, and died on September 24, 2023, at age 76. The CIA declassified the A-12 Oxcart program in 1989 and offered 7 surviving A-12 aircraft to museums. In 2007, CIA historian David Robage published the most comprehensive official account of the program's origins. One remarkable declassified revelation confirmed that U-2 and Oxcart flights accounted for more than 1/2 of all UFO reports during the late 1950s and most of the 1960s. The aircraft's extreme altitude and speed, combined with its reflective titanium surfaces catching sunlight at angles impossible for conventional aircraft, generated countless reports from commercial pilots and civilians who had never seen anything move that way. The mysterious aircraft that seemed to hover at impossible heights or streak across the sky faster than any known plane was often simply Kelly Johnson's creation doing exactly what it was designed to do. The technical reasons for the SR-71's invincibility were cumulative. No single Soviet system could overcome all of its advantages simultaneously. At its absolute maximum speed of approximately Mach 3.3, the SR-71 moved at 36.5 miles per minute, faster than a rifle bullet. At cruise speed of Mach 3.2 and 85,000 feet, it covered approximately 35 miles every 60 seconds. The time from radar detection through tracking, command authorization, fire control solution, weapon launch, and missile flight to altitude consistently exceeded the seconds the SR-71 spent in any given engagement zone. By the time a missile could reach the altitude where the Blackbird had been, the aircraft was already miles away. The iron ferrite paint that gave the aircraft its Blackbird name both reduced radar cross-section and radiated excess heat. Combined with the carefully shaped chines along the fuselage, this coating reduced the average radar signature to approximately 110 square feet, roughly 1/10 that of a comparably sized conventional aircraft. Head-on, the signature was dramatically smaller than, as low as 1/10 of a square foot according to some estimates. Radar operators had detection windows measured in seconds rather than minutes. The SR-71's electronic countermeasures suite included revolutionary deception jammers using range gate pull-off techniques. These systems absorbed enemy radar signals, memorized their characteristics, and retransmitted stronger false returns that drew missile guidance away from the actual aircraft. Some of these jamming techniques remain classified today and are still prohibited for use over the continental United States. When all else failed, the crew's ultimate defense was elegantly simple: push the throttles forward. As pilot B.C. Thomas explained after retirement, "I did not consider any Soviet interceptor aircraft to be a reliable threat. Our flying certainly was not hazard-free, because there is always that lucky shot. But no missile fired during the SR-71's operational career could catch an aircraft that was accelerating." The contrast with other reconnaissance aircraft is stark and sobering. The U-2 was shot down over the Soviet Union in 1960 and over Cuba in 1962. An RB-47 was shot down over the Barents Sea in July 1960. An EC-121 was destroyed by North Korean MiGs in 1969, killing all 31 crew members. Multiple other reconnaissance platforms were lost during Cold War peripheral missions. The SR-71's zero combat losses across 3,551 operational sorties in actively hostile airspace has no parallel in aviation history. The only confirmed instance of a Blackbird family aircraft being struck by hostile fire occurred on October 30, 1967, when CIA pilot Dennis Sullivan's A-12 Oxcart took shrapnel from an SA-2 fusing mechanism over Hanoi. Debris was found wedged in the composite leading edge during post-flight inspection. The aircraft completed its mission and returned safely. No SR-71 was ever confirmed hit by any weapon. The MiG-25 Foxbat, despite its terrifying reputation in Western intelligence circles, was fundamentally inadequate for the Blackbird intercept mission. The aircraft was developed in the late 1950s at the Mikoyan-Gurevich Bureau, the last aircraft designed by Mikhail Gurevich before his retirement. It was conceived primarily to counter the North American XB-70 Valkyrie Mach 3 bomber and the emerging Lockheed Blackbird threat. When the XB-70 was cancelled, the SR-71 became the MiG-25's primary quarry. The prototype flew in 1964, and the interceptor entered service in 1970. Approximately 1,186 were built. Western intelligence vastly overestimated the MiG-25 based on satellite photographs showing large wings, assuming it was a highly maneuverable air superiority fighter. In reality, it was a brute force interceptor built primarily of arc-welded nickel-steel alloy, not the titanium Western analysts had assumed. It could theoretically reach Mach 3.2, but doing so destroyed its engines. The absolute red line was Mach 2.83 for no more than 5 minutes, and pilots typically operated at Mach 2.5 to preserve engine life. Its service ceiling with a full missile load was 68,900 feet, roughly 15,000 feet below where the SR-71 cruised. The R-40 missiles it carried were designed for large, slow bomber-sized targets and lacked the velocity to overtake an SR-71 in a tail chase, or the guidance sophistication to solve the targeting problem in a head-on pass at closing speeds exceeding Mach 5. The MiG-31 Foxhound, which entered service in 1981, represented a genuine evolutionary leap in Soviet air defense capability. It featured the Zaslon N-007, the world's first fighter-phased array radar, capable of tracking 10 targets and engaging 4 simultaneously. Its R-33 missiles had a range of approximately 120 kilometers and were specifically designed for high-speed, high-altitude targets. Most critically, its digital data link allowed 4 MiG-31s to coordinate as a networked interceptor barrier covering 200 kilometers of airspace. Myagkiy believed the R-33 would have been lethal against the Blackbird. Had the spy plane violated Soviet airspace, a live missile launch would have been carried out, he claimed. There was practically no chance the aircraft could avoid an R-33 missile. But American crews assessed this very differently. Reconnaissance Systems Officer Kurt Osterheld stated that the only chance an interceptor would have at a decent shot was a beak-to-beak pass. I believed the velocity of closure and geometry of the required maneuver gave a very low probability of kill to this shot. The question was never resolved in combat. The SR-71 never violated Soviet airspace. It operated along the periphery, photographing terrain hundreds of miles inland with its powerful side-looking cameras and radar. The Soviets could watch it on their screens, scramble their fighters, and track it as it flew just outside their borders, but they could never touch it. Among surface-to-air systems, the SA-2 guideline was the primary threat during Vietnam operations, but essentially useless against the SR-71 at altitude. Its engagement window compressed to approximately 6 seconds as the Blackbird transited overhead at Mach 3.2. The SA-5 gammon was more concerning. This system was developed partly in response to the SR-71 threat, and its specifications were formidable. The S-200D variant could theoretically reach 131,000 feet at speeds up to Mach 8. SR-71 crews took the SA-5 seriously. Pilot B.C. Thomas noted after his career, "I was more concerned about the later versions of the Soviet SA-5 SAM than any other threat. The SA-5 could reach Mach 6 or more." A special National Security Agency electronic intelligence recorder was designed specifically for the SR-71 to collect SA-5 radar signatures. At least one mission to bait the Soviets into exposing their SA-5 system near Vladivostok was ordered at the highest level of the National Command Authority. Yet no confirmed SA-5 engagement against an SR-71 has ever been documented in the historical record. The SR-71's strategic value extended far beyond the airframe's technical capabilities. During the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when the State Department needed to assess the conflict's progress, Lieutenant Colonel Jim Shelton and Reconnaissance Systems Officer Gary Coleman flew an unprecedented 11.13-hour mission from Griffith Air Force Base, New York, through the Middle East and back. The sortie required 6 aerial refuelings and more than 5 hours above Mach 3. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger used the resulting photographs in a direct confrontation with Israeli Premier Golda Meir, laying successive Blackbird images before her, proving that Israeli forces had continued advancing despite her claims of a halt. During the Vietnam War, SR-71 cameras photographed cargo in the holds of ships in Hanoi Harbor and provided critical bomb damage assessments within hours, rather than the days required by satellite passes. In 1968, CIA A-12 aircraft located the captured USS Pueblo at Wonsan and confirmed no North Korean military mobilization, intelligence that influenced President Johnson to pursue diplomacy over military action. In 1987, Kadena-based SR-71 crews revealed Iranian Silkworm missile batteries threatening commercial shipping in the Persian Gulf. After the 1983 Marine barracks bombing in Lebanon, President Reagan ordered SR-71 reconnaissance of terrorist bases in the region. The aircraft's advantage over satellites was flexibility and timeliness. Satellites followed predictable orbital paths that adversaries could anticipate and prepare for. The SR-71 could be tasked to any target on short notice. From 80,000 feet, photo interpreters could identify car makes and models in parking lots. The advanced synthetic aperture radar system provided 1-foot resolution imagery in any weather, day or night. Soviet paranoia about SR-71 flights was well documented by neutral observers. Swedish radar stations observed the Soviet 15th Air Army scrambling interceptors from multiple nations simultaneously whenever a Blackbird appeared on the Baltic Express route. The resource drain was substantial. Multiple fighter regiments across northern, Baltic, and Far East sectors were dedicated to SR-71 intercept duty, maintaining constant alert postures week after week, year after year. The operational cost of the SR-71 program was approximately $250 million per year for the 12-plane fleet. This must be weighed against the cost the Soviets spent scrambling fighters, maintaining alert postures, and developing countermeasures every single week for 25 years. By any calculation, the Blackbird paid for itself many times over in the resources it forced the Soviet Union to expend. Brian Shul became the most famous SR-71 pilot through his memoir and public speaking. His path to the cockpit was itself extraordinary. Flying close air support in a T-28 Trojan during the Vietnam War, Shul was shot down near the Cambodian border. Unable to eject, he rode the burning aircraft into the jungle. A pararescue team extracted him from hostile territory. He endured 15 surgical procedures over a year in military hospitals and was told he would never fly again. 2 days after discharge, he was back in a fighter cockpit. He went on to fly A-7Ds and A-10s before being selected for the SR-71, passing the astronaut-level physical with no waivers despite his burn injuries. The story Shul told most often, which the Smithsonian has called the most repeated story about the SR-71 in history, occurred during his final training sortie with Reconnaissance Systems Officer Walter Watson. Flying at 80,000 feet over the American Southwest, they monitored Los Angeles Center's radio frequency. A Cessna pilot asked for a ground speed readout and was told 90 knots. A Twin Beech followed and received 125 knots. Then a Navy FA-18 pilot, audibly proud of his speed, requested the same. Dusty 5-2, ground speed check. The reply came back, Dusty 5-2, center, we have you at 620 on the ground. Shul wrote that his hand instinctively reached for the microphone button before he remembered Watson controlled the radios. Then he heard Watson key the mic. Los Angeles Center, Aspen 20, can you give us a ground speed check? The controller responded without hesitation. Aspen 20, I show you at 1,842 knots across the ground. Watson keyed the mic one final time. Ah, Center, much thanks, we are showing closer to 1900 on the money. The controller's voice cracked with something like wonder. Roger that, Aspen. Your equipment is probably more accurate than ours. You boys have a good one. Colonel Walter Watson, Shul's Reconnaissance Systems Officer, was the only African-American SR-71 crew member. He and Shul were described as forming a formidable team and friends forever. Watson controlled all the reconnaissance systems in the rear cockpit, while Shul flew the aircraft, their coordination honed through countless hours of training and operational missions. On April 16, 1986, following the F-111 strikes of Operation El Dorado Canyon against Libya, Shul and Watson flew their SR-71 over Tripoli at over 2,000 miles per hour for bomb damage assessment. Watson reported receiving SAM launch signals from what were likely SA-2 and SA-4 batteries. Shul pushed both throttles to the wall. The aircraft accelerated beyond its normal operating envelope to approximately Mach 3.2, the fastest any SR-71 was confirmed to have flown. I pulled the throttles to idle just south of Sicily, Shul recalled, but we still overran the refueling tanker awaiting us over Gibraltar. Shul died on May 20, 2023, moments after delivering his famous SR-71 presentation in Reno, Nevada. He was 75 years old. He collapsed on stage, having just finished telling the story he had told thousands of times, the story of the aircraft that had saved his career and given his life meaning after the crash that nearly killed him. He died doing what he loved, sharing the legend of the Blackbird with an audience that hung on every word. The statistics tell the story with finality. The SR-71 flew 3,551 operational sorties. The entire Blackbird family accumulated 11,675 hours above Mach 3. 12 of the 32 aircraft built were lost, all to mechanical failures or accidents, never to enemy action. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum's official description is unequivocal. No reconnaissance aircraft in history has operated globally in more hostile airspace or with such complete impunity than the SR-71. The SR-71 was retired not because it was defeated, but because it was expensive and politically inconvenient. General Larry Welch, Air Force Chief of Staff, led the campaign to end the program, wanting its funding redirected to the B-2 bomber. Ben Rich observed the institutional dynamics with frustration. A general would always prefer commanding a large fleet of conventional fighters or bombers that provides high visibility and glory. By contrast, buying into Blackbird would mean deep secrecy, small numbers, and no limelight. The formal decommissioning ceremony was held on January 26, 1990, though the last operational SR-71 flight occurred on March 6, when Lieutenant Colonel Ed Yalding and Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Vida set the Los Angeles to Washington speed record. General Norman Schwarzkopf lamented the SR-71's absence during Desert Storm just months later, when coalition forces needed real-time reconnaissance that satellites could not provide quickly enough. Congress allocated $100 million for reactivation in 1994. Senator Robert Byrd championed the effort, noting the National Reconnaissance Office had spent $300 million on a headquarters building while cutting the SR-71 for cost reasons. But institutional resistance within the Air Force, combined with President Clinton's line-item veto of the 1997 allocation, doomed the program permanently. The SR-71 was retired for the final time in September 1998. NASA operated 2 aircraft for research until October 9, 1999, when the final SR-71 flight ever occurred at Edwards Air Force Base. Every speed and altitude record set by the SR-71 still stands today. The absolute speed record of 2,193.167 miles per hour, set on July 28, 1976, by Captain Eldon George and Major George Morgan, has not been approached by any air-breathing crewed aircraft in half a century. The altitude record of 85,069 feet, set the same day by Captain Robert Helt and Major Larry Elliott, is equally unchallenged. The New York to London record of 1 hour 54 minutes and 56.4 seconds, set in 1974 by Major James Sullivan and Major Noel Widderfield, remains unbroken. The Los Angeles to Washington record of 64 minutes and 20 seconds, set by Yalding and Vida on that final operational flight, has never been approached. 20 SR-71s survive in museums across the world. The most prominent reside at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum's Udvar Hazy Center in Virginia, at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Ohio, and at the Imperial War Museum at Duxford in England, the only SR-71 outside the United States. Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works has proposed the SR-72, a hypersonic Mach 6 unmanned platform using turbine-based combined cycle propulsion. As of 2026, no confirmed prototype flight has occurred. The Blackbird's titanium manufacturing techniques, stealth principles, and propulsion innovations carried directly into the F-117 Nighthawk, B-2 Spirit, and F-22 Raptor programs. Kelly Johnson's Skunk Works methodology, small teams with minimal bureaucracy focused on rapid prototyping, remains the model for advanced aerospace development worldwide. The sign that hung at Kadena Air Base perhaps captured the aircraft's essence most concisely. "Though I fly through the valley of death, I shall fear no evil," it read, "for I am at 80,000 feet and climbing." Myagkiy retired from the Russian Air Force as a guards major, with the memories of 14 failed intercepts. Viktor Belenko lived out his days on a Wyoming ranch, forever looking over his shoulder. The SR-71 itself sits silent in museums now, its engines cold, its titanium skin no longer expanding in the heat of Mach 3 flight. But for 25 years, from 1966 to 1990, it owned the sky. More than 1,000 missiles were fired at it. Entire Soviet fighter regiments existed solely to intercept it. The finest pilots and engineers in the Soviet Union spent careers trying to bring one down. Every single one of them failed. The Blackbird was never defeated. It simply stopped flying. And when it did, the pilots who had chased it, who had watched it slip away time after time, who had seen their missiles fall short and their interceptors run out of speed and altitude, finally had their answer to the question that had consumed them for a generation. They could not catch it because nothing could.